The morning mist hung heavy over Buckingham Palace as Prince William stood at his office window, watching the guards change shift below. At 42, he carried himself with the quiet dignity expected of a future king, but today something weighed heavily on his shoulders. The encrypted phone in his pocket buzzed another message from his private secretary about the growing tensions within the palace walls. 3 months had passed since his father, King Charles III, had begun showing signs of fatigue that worried even the most loyal courtiers. The king's recent medical consultations, though kept strictly confidential, had created ripples of concern throughout the royal household. William knew the change was inevitable, but he hadn't anticipated how quickly the delicate balance of power would begin to shift. In the Queen's private sitting room, Camilla reviewed the morning's correspondence with her lady-in-waiting, Margaret Thornberry. The stack of letters seemed smaller than usual, and several events that had been on her calendar for weeks were now marked as postponed or under review. She tried to maintain her composure, but Margaret could see the frustration building behind her carefully maintained smile. "Your Majesty, perhaps we should discuss the schedule changes for next week," Margaret suggested gently, knowing that avoiding the subject would only make things worse. Camilla set down her reading glasses and looked directly at her most trusted aide. "Margaret, we both know what's happening here. The question is whether anyone has the courage to say it out loud." Down in the palace's security wing, Commander James Hartwell reviewed the latest intelligence reports with his deputy. At 58, Hartwell had served the royal family for over 2 decades, through scandals, celebrations, and everything in between. He prided himself on remaining politically neutral, but recent developments had forced him to reconsider his position. "Sir, we're receiving more requests for increased security around Prince William's engagements," Deputy Commander Sarah Reynolds reported. The Palace Communications Office is also asking for additional protection protocols for his upcoming tour of Wales. Hartwell nodded thoughtfully. The security apparatus around the royal family was like a complex ecosystem. Every change in one area affected everything else. He had noticed subtle shifts in how requests were being prioritized, how information flowed through different channels, and how certain members of the family were being positioned in public appearances. Prince William's afternoon was filled with briefings that would have been routine just months earlier but now carried undertones of political significance. His private secretary, David Morrison, had served 3 generations of royals and possessed an almost supernatural ability to read the political winds within the palace. "Sir, the Commonwealth heads of government have requested additional meetings with you during the upcoming summit," Morrison informed him as they walked through the palace corridors. "Several prime ministers have specifically asked for private audiences." William paused near a portrait of Queen Elizabeth II, his grandmother's steady gaze seeming to offer guidance from beyond. "And my stepmother's schedule during the summit?" Morrison's hesitation spoke volumes. "Her Majesty's engagements have been consolidated to accommodate other priorities." The euphemism hung in the air between them. William understood the delicate language of palace politics, where direct statements were rare and meaning was often found in what wasn't said rather than what was. That evening, in the private family quarters, King Charles sat in his favorite armchair, a stack of red boxes containing government papers beside him. The weight of the crown had always been substantial, but lately, it felt almost unbearable. His son entered quietly, and Charles gestured for him to sit. "William, we need to discuss the future," Charles began, his voice carrying a weariness that hadn't been there a year ago. "The doctors are optimistic, but we must be realistic about what lies ahead." Father and son sat in the comfortable silence that had developed between them over the years. William had always known this conversation would come, but he hadn't expected it to feel so sudden, so urgent. "The transition won't be easy," Charles continued. "There are competing interests, different visions for how the monarchy should evolve. Some changes may be necessary that we hadn't anticipated." William understood the subtext. His stepmother had carved out a significant role for herself as queen consort, but the dynamics were shifting in ways that couldn't be ignored. The British public, the Commonwealth realms, and even senior members of the royal household were beginning to look toward the future, a future that increasingly centered on William and Catherine. In her private apartment, Camilla sat with her son Tom Parker Bowles, one of the few people with whom she could speak completely freely. The conversation was difficult but necessary. "Mother, you have to know that people are talking," Tom said carefully. "The press is starting to pick up on the changes in protocol, the shift in public engagements." Camilla had spent years fighting to earn her place within the royal family, overcoming public skepticism and media hostility. She had worked tirelessly to support Charles and to fulfill her duties as queen consort. The thought that her position might be becoming untenable was almost too painful to contemplate. "I've given everything to this role, Tom. Everything." Her voice broke slightly, revealing the vulnerability she rarely showed even to her family. Meanwhile, in the palace's communication center, the team was working overtime to manage the delicate balance of public perception. Every photograph, every public appearance, every statement was carefully orchestrated to maintain stability while allowing for the gradual shifts that were becoming increasingly obvious to those who knew how to read the signs. Rebecca Hamilton, the deputy communications secretary, found herself in an impossible position. She had served both William and Camilla with equal dedication, but the competing priorities were becoming difficult to navigate. "We need to be very careful about how we handle the upcoming state dinner," she told her team. "The seating arrangements alone will send signals that will be analyzed by every royal correspondent in Europe." The younger members of the communications team exchanged glances. They had all noticed how their assignments had gradually shifted, with more resources being allocated to William and Catherine's activities while Camilla's profile was subtly diminished. As night fell over London, Commander Hartwell made a decision that would have profound implications for everyone involved. He requested a private meeting with Prince William for the following morning, not through the usual channels, but through a secure communication that bypassed the normal palace hierarchy. The message was simple but loaded with significance. "Sir, there are matters of security and protocol that require your immediate attention. The stability of the institution may depend on decisions made in the coming days." William read the message 3 times before deleting it. He understood that Commander Hartwell was one of the most experienced and loyal members of the royal household. If he was reaching out directly, the situation was more serious than even William had realized. In the quiet of his study, William began to understand that he was no longer simply preparing to be king someday in the distant future. Events were accelerating, and choices would need to be made that would define not only his reign but the future of the monarchy itself. The palace, with its centuries of tradition and protocol, was entering uncharted territory. The careful balance that had been maintained since Charles's accession was beginning to shift, and the consequences would be felt throughout the institution and beyond. As the clock tower chimed midnight, 3 very different people in 3 different parts of the palace were all contemplating the same truth. The royal family was about to face one of its most challenging periods in recent history, and the decisions made in the coming weeks would reshape everything they thought they knew about duty, loyalty, and power. The game of palace politics was entering a new phase, and the stakes had never been higher. Tomorrow would bring conversations that could no longer be delayed, decisions that could no longer be postponed, and changes that would ripple through the monarchy for generations to come. The morning would reveal just how much had already changed, and how much more was yet to come. The early morning security briefing took place in Commander Hartwell's private office, a room that had witnessed countless sensitive discussions over the years. Prince William arrived precisely at 7 o'clock, dressed in a dark suit that conveyed both authority and accessibility. The commander had carefully chosen the timing early enough to avoid the normal palace traffic, late enough to ensure they wouldn't be interrupted. "Your Royal Highness, thank you for making time for this conversation," Hartwell began, his military bearing evident even in civilian clothes. "What I'm about to share with you comes from 23 years of service to your family, and I hope you'll understand that my loyalty is to the institution above all else." William settled into his chair, recognizing the gravity in Hartwell's tone. "James, you've served my family with distinction through some of our most challenging times. I trust your judgment completely." The commander opened a secure folder containing intelligence reports, correspondence, and detailed analyses that painted a picture of growing instability within the palace structure. "Sir, we're seeing unprecedented divisions among the staff, competing loyalties, and what can only be described as factional behavior. This isn't just about protocol or precedence, it's affecting our ability to protect and serve the royal family effectively. The reports detailed incidents that individually might have seemed minor: staff members refusing to take orders from certain sources, communication breakdowns between different departments, and subtle acts of resistance that were undermining the smooth functioning of the household. The situation with Her Majesty the Queen Consort is becoming particularly problematic, Hartwell continued carefully. Several senior staff members have approached me privately, expressing concerns about conflicting directives and unclear chains of command. William absorbed this information with the composure he had learned from years of training, but, internally, he felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a heavy cloak.
What are you recommending, James?
Sir, I believe we need to establish clear lines of authority before this situation deteriorates further. The security and protection of the royal family depends on unified command structure. Right now, we're operating with competing centers of power, and that's a dangerous situation for everyone involved. Across the palace, Catherine was meeting with her private secretary, Emma Richardson, to review a schedule that had become increasingly complex. As the Princess of Wales, Catherine had carefully built her public role around causes she was passionate about: early childhood development, mental health awareness, and the arts. But, lately, her schedule had been expanded to include engagements that traditionally would have fallen to other members of the royal family. "Ma'am, the Palace Communications Office has asked if you would be available to represent the family at the Commonwealth Education Summit next month," Emma informed her.
It's a significant engagement that would normally involve multiple senior royals.
Catherine paused in her review of the briefing documents.
She understood the implications of such requests. Emma, who else was originally scheduled to attend?
Her Majesty the Queen Consort was listed as the primary royal patron, but there's been a change in priorities.
Emma's diplomatic language couldn't hide the reality of what was happening.
Catherine had worked hard to maintain good relationships with all members of the royal family, including her stepmother-in-law. The growing tensions weren't lost on her, but she found herself caught between loyalty to her husband and respect for family harmony. Meanwhile, in the Queen's private office, Camilla was having an increasingly difficult conversation with her private secretary, Anthony Pemberton. The 55-year-old career civil servant had served various members of the royal family throughout his career, but he had never faced a situation quite like this one. "Your Majesty, I must advise you that several organizations have requested to modify their patronage arrangements," Pemberton said delicately. "The Commonwealth Women's Alliance and the National Literacy Trust have both indicated they would like to discuss changes to their royal associations."
Camilla felt each word like a physical blow.
These organizations had been central to her public work as Queen Consort, causes she had championed with genuine passion and dedication. The thought that they might be distancing themselves from her felt like a betrayal of everything she had worked to achieve.
"Anthony, I need you to be completely honest with me," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil she felt inside. "Is this coming from the organizations themselves, or is there pressure being applied from within the palace?"
Pemberton's silence was more revealing than any answer he could have given. After 20 years of navigating palace politics, Camilla understood exactly what his hesitation meant. The afternoon brought a meeting that everyone had been dreading, but no one could avoid any longer. King Charles had requested the presence of both William and Camilla in his private study, ostensibly to discuss upcoming state visits but really to address the growing tensions that threatened to tear the royal household apart. Charles looked older than his years as he sat behind the desk that had belonged to his mother. The weight of recent medical consultations and the stress of managing family dynamics had taken a visible toll. He gestured for his son and wife to sit in the chairs he had arranged facing each other, a subtle but deliberate choice that forced them to confront each other directly.
"We cannot continue as we have been," Charles began without preamble.
"The palace is becoming divided, and that division is starting to show publicly.
We have a responsibility to the crown that transcends personal feelings or individual ambitions."
William shifted uncomfortably. He had never wanted to be in a position where his loyalty to his father might conflict with what he believed was best for the monarchy, but events were forcing him into exactly that position.
Camilla spoke first, her voice controlled but emotional.
"Charles, I have given everything to this role. I've endured years of public scrutiny, worked tirelessly to support you and the institution, and earned my place through dedication and service. I won't be pushed aside simply because some people find it politically convenient. Camilla, no one is questioning your dedication or your service, William replied carefully. But, we have to acknowledge that circumstances are changing. The public, the Commonwealth, Parliament, they're all looking toward the future, and we need to position the monarchy for success in that future. The tension in the room was palpable. These were three people who genuinely cared for each other, but they found themselves on different sides of a fundamental question about the direction of the royal family. Charles struggled to find words that would bridge the growing divide. There must be a way to honor everyone's contributions while also ensuring the stability of the institution. The monarchy has survived by adapting to changing circumstances while maintaining its core values. With respect, Charles, adaptation can't always mean accommodation, William said, his voice gentle but firm. Sometimes it requires difficult decisions about priorities and resources. We have limited capacity, and we need to focus that capacity where it will be most effective. Camilla felt the walls closing in around her. She had fought so hard for acceptance and recognition, only to find herself potentially being maneuvered out of the central role she had occupied. So what are you suggesting? That I step back from my duties? That I become a ceremonial figure with no real responsibilities? The question hung in the air unanswered because they all knew that was exactly what was being suggested, even if no one was willing to say it directly. That evening, Commander Hartwell convened a meeting with his senior security staff that would prove to be a turning point in the developing crisis. The 5 most experienced protection officers gathered in the secure conference room typically used for threat assessments and emergency planning. Ladies and gentlemen, we face an unprecedented situation, Hartwell began. The royal household is experiencing internal divisions that are affecting our ability to provide effective protection and support. We need to make some difficult decisions about how we allocate our resources and structure our operations. Deputy Commander Reynolds spoke for the group when she asked the question they were all thinking. Sir, are you asking us to choose sides? Hartwell considered his words carefully. I'm asking you to prioritize the long-term security and stability of the institution we've sworn to protect. Sometimes that means making choices that are painful in the short term but necessary for the future. The conversation that followed would later be described by one participant as the most difficult professional discussion of my career. These were men and women who had dedicated their lives to serving the royal family, and they were being asked to make judgments about competing claims to their loyalty and service. Senior Protection Officer Michael Crawford, who had served Prince William for over a decade, finally broke the uncomfortable silence. Sir, if we're being completely honest, the operational challenges we're facing are becoming unsustainable. We're getting conflicting directives, competing priorities, and unclear command structures. From a purely practical standpoint, something has to change. The others nodded in agreement. They had all experienced the growing difficulties in coordinating security arrangements, managing public engagements, and maintaining the seamless operation that the public expected from royal events. The Prince of Wales represents the future of the monarchy, added Chief Inspector Patricia Williams, who oversaw ceremonial protection. From a security perspective, our primary obligation has to be to ensure that transition happens smoothly and safely. Hartwell looked around the table at the faces of people he had worked with for years, people whose judgment he trusted implicitly. Are we all in agreement that our resources and focus should be primarily directed toward supporting Prince William and Princess Catherine going forward? The unanimous agreement was both swift and sobering. These career professionals, bound by duty and loyalty, had reached a collective decision that would effectively determine the outcome of the palace power struggle. As the meeting concluded, each participant understood that they had crossed a line from which there would be no return. They had chosen sides in a conflict that would reshape the royal family, and they had chosen based on their professional judgment about what was best for the institution they served. News of the security team's decision spread through the palace with the speed that only the most significant developments could achieve. By the time the evening news began broadcasting, senior palace staff throughout the building understood that a fundamental shift had occurred in the balance of power within the royal household. In her private apartment, Camilla sat alone, finally, allowing herself to feel the full weight of what was happening. She had known this day might come, but she had hoped that her years of service and dedication would count for more when the moment of reckoning arrived. The phone calls she made that evening were among the most difficult of her life, conversations with family members, close friends, and long-serving staff who had supported her throughout her journey from controversial figure to queen consort. Each call was an acknowledgement that her position was no longer secure, that the role she had worked so hard to earn was slipping away. Meanwhile, William found himself grappling with emotions he hadn't fully anticipated. Victory in palace politics felt hollow when it came at the cost of family relationships and personal loyalty. But he also understood that leadership sometimes required making difficult choices, even when those choices hurt people you cared about. The palace corridors, usually bustling with activity even in the evening hours, seemed quieter than usual. Staff members went about their duties with the careful precision that marks significant transitions, everyone aware that they were witnessing history in the making. As London settled into another night, the royal family faced a new reality that none of them had truly prepared for, despite years of planning for various contingencies. The careful balance that had maintained stability was giving way to a new order, one that would reshape not only the internal dynamics of the palace but also the public face of the British monarchy. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, difficult conversations, and irreversible decisions. But tonight, the die had been cast, and everyone involved understood that there was no going back to the way things had been. The morning brought unprecedented developments that would forever alter the landscape of the British royal family. As dawn broke over Buckingham Palace, a carefully orchestrated series of meetings began that would formalize what had been brewing beneath the surface for months. King Charles arrived at his private office earlier than usual, his face bearing the weight of decisions that had kept him awake most of the night. His private secretary, Sir Clive Alderton, had prepared a briefing folder containing options that 6 months ago would have been unthinkable. The king's declining health, combined with the growing palace divisions, had created a perfect storm that demanded immediate action. "Clive, have the senior household staff been informed about this morning's announcements?" Charles asked, settling into his chair with obvious fatigue. "Yes, Your Majesty. The keeper of the privy purse, the private secretary, and the master of the household have all been briefed. They understand that discretion is paramount until the official communications are released." Sir Clive's 30 years of palace service had prepared him for many crises, but never one quite like this. The first domino fell at precisely 9 o'clock when Camilla's private secretary, Anthony Pemberton, was summoned to meet with Sir Clive. The conversation was brief but devastating in its implications. "Anthony, Her Majesty the Queen Consort's public engagements will be significantly reduced effective immediately," Sir Clive informed him with the diplomatic precision that masked the brutality of palace politics. "She will retain her patronages, but her active participation in royal duties will be limited." Pemberton had been expecting this conversation, but hearing it officially still felt like a punch to the stomach. "Sir, may I ask about the reasoning behind this decision?" "Her Majesty has maintained excellent relationships with her patronages and has received positive public feedback on her recent engagements. Anthony, this decision comes from the highest levels and reflects the changing needs of the monarchy as we move forward. The transition of responsibilities to Prince William and Princess Catherine is accelerating, and resources must be allocated accordingly." The euphemistic language couldn't disguise what was really happening. Camilla was being systematically removed from her position of influence within the royal family, regardless of her personal feelings or the quality of her service. Across the palace, William was meeting with a delegation that would have been impossible to convene just weeks earlier. Commander Hartwell had arranged for the heads of all major royal household departments to meet with the Prince of Wales not as a courtesy or consultation, but as a formal recognition of his emerging authority. "Your Royal Highness, we want you to know that the household staff is fully prepared to support the transition of responsibilities," declared Mrs. Elizabeth Morrison, the master of the household. At 62, she had served the royal family for over 2 decades and understood the significance of this moment better than most. "We've reviewed all operational procedures and identified areas where efficiency can be improved through consolidated leadership," added the Deputy Private Secretary, Robert Henderson. "The staff is united in their commitment to ensuring seamless service during this transition period." William looked around the room at faces that represented centuries of combined royal service. These people had chosen to align themselves with him not out of personal ambition, but because they believed it was best for the institution they had devoted their careers to serving. I appreciate your confidence, but I want to be clear that this transition must be handled with the utmost respect for all members of the royal family, William said carefully. We're not dismantling anything, we're evolving to meet the challenges of the future while honoring our traditions and obligations. The diplomatic language was necessary, but everyone in the room understood the reality. Camilla's influence was being methodically transferred to William and Catherine, whether she agreed with the process or not. Meanwhile, in her private apartment, Camilla was having the most difficult conversation of her royal career with her son Tom and daughter Laura. They had flown in from their respective homes after receiving urgent calls from their mother's staff. "Mummy, you can't let them do this to you," Laura said, her voice filled with the protective anger that only a daughter could feel. "You've worked too hard and sacrificed too much to be pushed aside like this." Tom, always the more pragmatic of her two children, took a different approach. "Mother, what are your realistic options? If the king is supporting this transition, and William has the backing of the household staff, fighting it might only make things worse for everyone." Camilla looked at her children, seeing in their faces the same mixture of love and concern that had sustained her through the most challenging periods of her public life. "My darlings, sometimes grace under pressure means knowing when to step back with dignity rather than fighting a battle you cannot win." The words were difficult to say, but Camilla had always prided herself on being a realist. She could see the writing on the wall as clearly as anyone, and continuing to resist would only create more pain for the family and more instability for the monarchy. "But what about your charities, your patronages? You've built real relationships with these organizations," Laura pressed. "Some things will continue, but others will change," Camilla replied with the composure she had learned to maintain during years of public scrutiny. "The important thing is that the work continues, even if my role becomes different." The afternoon brought a meeting that had been dreaded by everyone involved but could no longer be avoided. Charles, William, and Camilla gathered in the king's private study for a conversation that would formally acknowledge what had already been decided through the actions and allegiances of the past few days. Charles spoke first, his voice heavy with the weight of family and institutional obligations. "We need to discuss the practical arrangements going forward. The doctors have advised that my schedule should be reduced, and the household staff has recommended that more responsibilities be transferred to William and Catherine." William felt the burden of the moment settling on his shoulders. "Father, I want you to know that I understand the difficulty of this situation for everyone involved. My goal is to ensure stability and continuity, not to create unnecessary conflict." Camilla had prepared herself for this moment, but hearing it discussed so matter-of-factly still felt like a betrayal of everything she had worked for. "Charles, I need to understand exactly what this means for my role going forward. Will I retain any meaningful responsibilities, or am I being relegated to ceremonial appearances?" The directness of her question forced them all to confront the reality they had been dancing around with diplomatic language. Charles struggled to find words that would soften the blow, but William stepped in with the honesty that the situation demanded. "Camilla, your contributions to the royal family have been significant, and that won't be forgotten. But we need to concentrate our resources and public attention on the future of the monarchy. That means Catherine and I will be taking on expanded roles, including some responsibilities that have traditionally been yours." "And my opinion in this matter?" Camilla asked, though she already knew the answer. "This isn't about anyone's opinion," Charles said quietly. "It's about what's necessary for the institution. Sometimes personal preferences have to be secondary to larger obligations." The finality in his voice made it clear that this wasn't a negotiation or a discussion, it was an announcement of decisions that had already been made. That evening, the palace communications office worked feverishly to craft announcements that would present the dramatic changes as natural evolution rather than internal conflict. Rebecca Hamilton found herself writing press releases that would reshape public understanding of the royal family while trying to maintain the dignity of all involved. "We need to emphasize continuity and stability," she told her team as they reviewed drafts of the official statements. "This is about the natural progression of responsibilities as the monarchy adapts to changing circumstances." The challenge was immense: how to explain Camilla's reduced role without suggesting conflict, how to highlight William's expanded authority without undermining Charles's position as king, and how to present radical changes as routine adjustments. Throughout the palace, staff members were quietly adjusting to the new reality. Office assignments were changed, reporting structures were modified, and the subtle but significant protocols that governed daily life in the royal household were rewritten to reflect the shift in power. Senior staff member Margaret Thornberry, who had served Camilla faithfully for years, found herself facing an uncertain future. "Mrs. Hamilton, what happens to those of us who have been primarily assigned to Her Majesty's household?" she asked during a private meeting. "Margaret, your experience and dedication are valued, and we'll work to find appropriate positions within the restructured household," Rebecca replied diplomatically. But they both understood that many positions would be eliminated or significantly changed as Camilla's official activities were reduced. As night fell over London, 3 very different scenes played out in different parts of the palace. In his private study, Charles sat alone with a glass of whiskey, contemplating whether he had made the right choices in allowing, perhaps encouraging, the dramatic changes that were reshaping his family. William and Catherine sat in their apartment, discussing the weight of responsibilities that were falling on their shoulders faster than anyone had anticipated. They both understood that their lives had changed irrevocably in the space of just a few days. "William, are we ready for this?" Catherine asked, voicing the concern that both of them felt but rarely discussed. "I don't think anyone is ever truly ready for this level of responsibility," William replied honestly. "But I believe we have the support we need and the commitment to serve well." In her apartment, Camilla sat at her writing desk, composing letters to the organizations and charities that had become central to her public work. Each letter was a small goodbye to a role she had fought hard to earn and was now being forced to surrender. The letters were difficult to write, not because she didn't know what to say, but because each one represented a piece of the identity she had built as queen consort being stripped away. But she wrote them with the grace that had carried her through previous challenges, focusing on the future of the causes rather than her personal disappointment. Outside the palace walls, London continued its nightly rhythm, unaware that inside those historic buildings, one of the most significant transitions in recent royal history was being finalized. By morning, the British monarchy would look fundamentally different, even if the changes weren't immediately visible to the public. The game of palace politics had reached its conclusion, at least for this phase. William had emerged as the clear winner, backed by the institutional power of the royal household and the practical necessities of a changing monarchy. Camilla had been gracefully but decisively sidelined, her influence curtailed and her role diminished. But victories in palace politics often came with unexpected costs, and the true price of these changes would only become clear in the months and years ahead. For now, though, the immediate crisis had been resolved, the power structure had been clarified, and the monarchy was preparing to present a united front to the world, regardless of the private turmoil that had brought about this new order. The royal family would wake up tomorrow to a fundamentally different reality, one that had been shaped by loyalty, ambition, pragmatism, and the unforgiving demands of institutional survival. 6 weeks later, the transformation of the British royal family was complete, though the public was only beginning to understand the magnitude of what had occurred behind the palace walls. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Prince William's expanded office suite, where he was reviewing intelligence briefings that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. The transition had been accomplished with the surgical precision that only the British royal household could achieve. To outside observers, it appeared as though the changes were part of a natural evolution, carefully planned and smoothly executed. The reality had been far messier, filled with personal anguish and institutional calculations that prioritized survival over sentiment. Catherine entered the office carrying a folder containing correspondence from Commonwealth Prime Ministers, all of whom had requested meetings with the Prince and Princess of Wales during the upcoming diplomatic tour. At 32, she had transformed from a reluctant royal wife into a confident partner in what had become an informal co-regency. "The response to our Australian tour announcement has been overwhelmingly positive," she reported, settling into the chair that had become her regular spot for their morning briefings. "The Prime Minister's office has requested additional public engagements, and the Governor-General wants to discuss expanded royal representation in the Pacific region." William nodded, but his attention was focused on a more sensitive document that had arrived through secure channels that morning. King Charles's medical team had provided an update that confirmed what everyone had been reluctantly acknowledging: his father's condition was declining more rapidly than previously expected. "Catherine, we need to discuss the timeline for more formal responsibility transfers," William said quietly. "The doctors are recommending that we begin preparing for scenarios that we had hoped were still months away." The weight of impending kingship had settled on William's shoulders gradually, but recently the pace had accelerated dramatically. Constitutional experts had been quietly consulted, parliamentary leaders had been briefed, and the mechanisms for transition had been tested in ways that the public would never know about. Meanwhile, in a much smaller office on the other side of the palace, Camilla was meeting with the reduced staff that remained assigned to her household. The contrast with her previous setup was stark. Where once she had commanded significant resources and attention, she now operated with a skeleton crew that handled only her most essential engagements. "Your Majesty, the National Literacy Trust has confirmed that your speech at their annual gala will proceed as planned," reported Jennifer Hayes, her new private secretary. Jennifer was competent and dedicated, but she lacked the seniority and connections of Anthony Pemberton, who had been reassigned to William's expanded team. Camilla reviewed her calendar, which showed a schedule that would have been busy for a minor royal but felt nearly empty compared to her previous responsibilities as queen consort. The careful reorganization had been presented as a natural adjustment to changing circumstances, but she understood it for what it really was, a managed decline in her influence and visibility. "Jennifer, I want you to know that I appreciate your professionalism during this transition period," Camilla said with genuine warmth. "I know this situation hasn't been easy for any of the staff." "Ma'am, if I may say so, your grace under these circumstances has been remarkable," Jennifer replied. "The household staff all recognize the dignity with which you've handled these changes." The compliment was sincere, but it also highlighted how far Camilla had fallen from her position just months earlier. Where once senior staff competed for her attention and sought her approval, now junior staff offered consolation for her reduced circumstances. The afternoon brought a family gathering that had been scheduled to celebrate Princess Anne's birthday but carried undertones of the new power dynamics that now governed royal family relationships. The private dining room in Clarence House had been chosen for its intimacy, but the seating arrangements told their own story about who held real influence within the family. Charles presided over the gathering with his usual charm, but even his closest relatives could see the toll that recent months had taken on him. His conversation was as engaging as ever, but his energy flagged noticeably as the afternoon progressed, requiring subtle interventions from William to maintain the flow of discussion. Princess Anne, with her characteristic directness, addressed the elephant in the room during a lull in conversation. "Charles, we all understand that changes have been necessary, but I hope we can maintain family cohesion despite the political necessities." William appreciated his aunt's forthrightness, but he also understood that family cohesion was a luxury that institutional survival couldn't always accommodate. "Aunt Anne, I think we all want to preserve family relationships, but we also have obligations that sometimes require difficult decisions." Camilla participated in the conversation with the poise she had maintained throughout the transition, but everyone at the table could feel the undercurrents of tension. She had been invited to family gatherings as a courtesy, but her input on royal matters was no longer sought or valued in the way it had been when she was a central figure in the monarchy's operation. "I think we should focus on the positive aspects of these changes," Catherine interjected diplomatically. "The royal family has always adapted to meet the needs of the times, and that flexibility has been one of our greatest strengths." Her words were carefully chosen to support the official narrative while acknowledging the personal costs of the transformation. Catherine had worked hard to maintain cordial relationships with all family members, but she also understood that her primary loyalty had to be to the institution and to the role she would soon be called upon to fulfill. Later that evening, William found himself in his father's private study, having a conversation that both of them had been avoiding for weeks. The room was filled with the accumulated weight of royal history, portraits of previous monarchs, ceremonial objects that had been passed down through generations, and books that contained the accumulated wisdom of centuries of kingship. "William, I need to discuss the possibility of accelerating certain transitions," Charles began, his voice carrying the fatigue that had become increasingly apparent in recent weeks. "The constitutional experts believe we should begin preparing for more formal arrangements that might become necessary sooner than we had hoped." William understood the subtext. His father was preparing him for the possibility that abdication might become necessary not as a choice, but as a recognition of practical limitations that could no longer be ignored. "Father, whatever decisions need to be made, I want you to know that I'm prepared to accept the responsibilities," William replied. "But I also want to ensure that the transition preserves the dignity of the monarchy and protects the family's reputation." Charles nodded slowly. "The arrangement with Camilla has been handled well, despite the personal cost. She has shown remarkable grace, and I hope history will recognize her contributions even if her current role has been necessarily reduced." The conversation was painful for both men. Charles was essentially acknowledging that his wife had been sacrificed for institutional necessity, while William was accepting responsibility for decisions that had fundamentally altered his stepmother's life. The security briefings suggest that public opinion has been largely supportive of the changes, William continued, trying to offer some comfort to his father. "Commander Hartwell reports that the transition has actually strengthened public confidence in the monarchy's stability." Charles appreciated his son's attempt to find positive aspects of a difficult situation, but he also understood the personal costs that couldn't be measured in opinion polls or security assessments. "William, success in royal duty often requires sacrificing personal relationships for institutional needs. It's one of the heaviest burdens of wearing the crown." As winter deepened over London, the new order within the royal family settled into routine. Public appearances were carefully choreographed to present unity while reflecting the changed hierarchy. William and Catherine's prominence increased with each engagement, while Camilla's appearances became less frequent and were positioned as special occasions rather than regular duties. The British press, always sensitive to shifts in royal dynamics, began to pick up on the changes. Royal correspondents noted the altered patterns of engagement, the modified protocols, and the subtle but significant changes in how the family presented itself to the public. Rebecca Hamilton found herself fielding increasingly sophisticated questions from journalists who understood that something significant had occurred within the palace walls. Her responses were carefully crafted to acknowledge change while avoiding any suggestion of conflict or controversy. The royal family continues to evolve to meet the changing needs of the Commonwealth, and the British people became her standard response to questions about the altered dynamics. Prince William and Princess Catherine are naturally taking on expanded roles as they prepare for their future responsibilities. The diplomatic language served its purpose, but experienced royal watchers could read between the lines. The monarchy had undergone a quiet revolution, one that had been accomplished without public drama but with profound implications for the institution's future direction. In her reduced role, Camilla found unexpected opportunities for reflection and personal growth. Without the constant pressure of major royal duties, she was able to focus more deeply on the causes that had always been closest to her heart. Her work with literacy programs and domestic violence charities became more personally meaningful, even if it reached fewer people than her previous high-profile engagements. "Sometimes less can be more," she confided to Tom during one of their regular calls. "I miss the excitement and the sense of being at the center of things, but there's also relief in having fewer obligations and expectations." Her children had watched the transition with a mixture of anger and admiration. Anger at how their mother had been treated, admiration for how she had handled an impossible situation with dignity and grace. As spring approached, the royal family prepared for what would be their first major international tour under the new arrangements. William and Catherine would represent the crown in a multi-nation visit to the Pacific region, while Charles remained in London with a reduced schedule, and Camilla handled carefully selected domestic engagements. The tour would serve as a public test of the new dynamic, demonstrating whether the changes that had been implemented privately could be sustained under the intense scrutiny of international media and diplomatic protocol. "This tour will essentially announce our transition to the world," Catherine observed during a final planning meeting. "Everyone will be watching to see how we handle our expanded responsibilities." William understood the weight of the moment. "We've had months to prepare, and we have the full support of the household staff and the Foreign Office. This is our opportunity to show that the monarchy is prepared for the future while honoring its traditions." The conversation took place in the same office where, just months earlier, Commander Hartwell had first outlined the security concerns that had precipitated the dramatic changes. Now, as they prepared to take center stage on the world's diplomatic forum, both William and Catherine understood that they were no longer preparing for future responsibilities, they were living them. The transformation of the British royal family was complete, at least in its initial phase. Power had been transferred, hierarchies had been re-established, and the institution had been repositioned for the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. But the human cost of these changes lingered in the background, a reminder that even the most necessary institutional adaptations came with personal sacrifices that would be felt for years to come. The monarchy had survived another transition, as it had so many times before, but the price of survival had been measured in relationships, roles, and the quiet dreams of people whose lives had been reshaped by forces beyond their control. As London awakened to another day, the royal family prepared to present their new face to the world, united in purpose if not entirely healed from the wounds that such dramatic change inevitably created. The palace corridors hummed with the efficient activity that marked periods of significant transition, while outside, the British public remained largely unaware of the intimate human drama that had reshaped one of their most enduring institutions. The game of palace politics had concluded, at least for now, but its consequences would ripple through the royal family and the broader monarchy for generations to come.